For over a decade, Syria has been under international sanctions aimed at pressuring Bashar Al Assad's regime. But sanctions on Syria go way back. There's a long history of sanctions on Syria and the broader Middle East. They come as a nudge or shove from government to government, usually during times of war.
The United States has imposed sanctions on the Syrian president over human rights abuses. It's the first time.
But their impacts last even into times of relative peace, trickling from the highest ranks of the ruling class to the laborers and families that make up the backbone of said country's economy. That's where the problems begin.
The United States imposed its toughest sanctions ever on Syria on Wednesday, aiming to choke off revenue for Syrian President Bashar Al Assad's
We've seen sanctions ravage Syria's economy on and off since the 1970s. We saw them stick throughout the course of its 14-year-old civil war, which some might argue isn't over. But after the fall of Assad in December of 2024, Syria's got a new government, a new head of state and a caretaker cabinet that promises to rebuild. This is Business Extra from the National News in Abu Dhabi, and I'm your host, Salim Al-Saeed. On this episode, we're looking at sanctions on Syria from the top down, the complexities of these sanctions, and how the country's economy might evolve after they're lifted.
Forward.
Almost as soon as the civil war broke out in 2011, the sanctions hit. The US led the charge. It placed heavy-handed economic sanctions on Syria following the Assad regime's repressive crackdown on civil protest. In order to understand how they work, we've got to understand where they come from. So for a moment here on the business desk, we're going to take a brief but necessary look at politics. Here's our own Vanessa Ghanem, who's the Arab Affairs editor here at The National. She's joining us from the foreign team with some key info on Syria's sanctions. Vanessa, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start from the very beginning. What are sanctions? How do they work?
So, sanctions in general are economic and political measures imposed by countries or international organizations to influence the behavior of governments, entities, or even individuals. They are usually used to achieve foreign policy and national security objectives without direct military intervention. Now, sanctions could be economic, diplomatic, military, or sectoral, meaning that they target specific industries such as energy, aviation, banking, transport, etc., to limit their international operations. How do they work? They are enforced through financial tracking, trade restrictions, and legal actions. And it's very important to note that companies and banks must comply to avoid legal action.
The sanctions that the new government is hoping will ease up are for the most part remnants of sanctions originally placed on the Assad regime. Tell us about those. What are the current sanctions on Syria?
Sanctions on Syria date back to late 70s. Syria has been designated by the US as a state sponsor of terrorism since December 1979 as a result of its occupation of Lebanon and its sponsorship of the Iran-backed militant group Hezbollah. Additional sanctions and restrictions were added in May 2004. And then, in response to the Syrian government's violent crackdown on pro-democracy protests in 2011, the US, EU, and other Western countries imposed sanctions on Syria. Now, these included asset freezes, travel bans, and trade restrictions targeting Bashar Al Assad's government. And then, as the conflict escalated into a civil war, more sanctions were added to pressure the Assad regime. There were also reports of chemical weapons attacks, indiscriminate bombing, and mass detentions, all of which led to stricter sanctions.
We've seen the impact on livelihood from these types of sanctions before. Take the case of Iraq in the 90s. The country was devastated by food insecurity. Its oil was virtually embargoed. We've seen some of the same with Syria.
Well, of course, sanctions on Syria had previously impacted the government of Bashar Al Assad, and it's actually currently impacting the new government. But as you said, it had a devastating impact on the country's economy and, by extension, the livelihoods of its people. So Syria has been isolated for years. The situation is getting better now. We need also to mention energy and fuel shortages, power outages. There's also, of course, a humanitarian crisis, unemployment, poverty, brain drain. The combination of political instability, economic hardships, and a lack of opportunity has caused millions of Syrians to flee the country. They are in other parts of the Middle East and in Europe as well. And most importantly, sanctions have had an impact on reconstruction.
What can we expect now?
So the thing is, the future of Syria remains highly uncertain as the country navigates a post-Assad era with its economic recovery, international relations, and political landscape still in flux. International actors are following a wait-and-see approach with the new government. The international community wants to see inclusivity, a representation of minority groups, control of sectarian violence. Now we have a new government in place, and this is only the beginning. So again, there's a wait-and-see approach. However, many say that while the US and Europe have reasons to be wary of financing Ahmad al-Shara, given his past with roots in Al-Qaeda, they are underestimating the dangers of inaction. So if Syria's economy continues to fall, extremists and those with an interest in creating chaos will be the only beneficiaries here, and violence will surely erupt again. So while it's understandable that US and the EU haven't completely lifted sanctions on Syria, what's happening on the ground merit more attention, and maybe more action should be taken in this regard.
Vanessa, thanks a lot. We'll be right back.
Are you interested in modern Middle Eastern culture? Want to learn more about which museums, concerts, movies, books and music are popular in the Arab region? And how is the world viewed from another lens? Listen to the Culture Bites podcast from the National News in Abu Dhabi every Thursday. Join me, Inas Rafai, and my co-host, Farah Andrews, as we discuss all the stories and events shaping the arts and culture scene here in the UAE.
Thanks for joining us. This is Business Extra. Sanctions, by design, tend to trickle down. Take the international sanctions imposed on Iraq in 1990 after the invasion of Kuwait.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died.
By name, they targeted Saddam Hussein and his government, an effort to compel Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. In practice, they left swaths of their population reeling from malnutrition, disease, and lack of power.
I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
Eventually, the same started happening with Syria. Sanctions came from every corner. A largely impoverished Syria struggled with food insecurity, and its dictatorial head of state grasped for funds.
We're here in the Captagon factory in the outskirts of Damascus.
Captagon.
The factory has been used for manufacturing these.
Under strict economic sanctions from neighbors in the region and states across the globe, Bashar Al Assad turned to this highly addictive drug. It's sold as tiny pills that have breached borders in the Middle East and beyond. The global Captagon market was estimated to be worth about $10 billion a year. 80% of that was produced in Syria. Now, Syrians are hoping all of that will turn around. On March 29, Syria's interim president elected a new caretaker cabinet. Among the 23 freshly appointed members, one, Nidal al-Sha'ar, economic minister. In his first remarks after his appointment, he laid out a seemingly perfect plan. Strengthen production, support small and medium-sized ventures, encourage creativity and innovation. Russian media recently quoted him saying the administration would put out a comprehensive economic plan soon. Until then, we're hearing from Qutayba Idlibi, a senior fellow with Atlantic Council's Middle East programs, where he leads the council's work on Syria.
I think overall there has been a little bit of an improvement in the last 4 months, but I think there is a big question how long kind of like this revival will continue.
He's here to tell us what that plan might look like and what Syria really needs.
So right now, specifically after Assad ran away, I think there are two specific dynamics facing Syria when it comes to the economy. I think the first one, of course, the fact that Syria is one of the most sanctioned countries around the world. Usually in the region, people mix up between UN embargoes, between US sanctions. On Syria specifically, we're talking about US sanctions. I think, however, the one unique model in US sanctions that were imposed in Syria is the Caesar Act of 2019.
Passing, and now the implementation of a bill in the US, the so-called Caesar Act,
which technically didn't really prevent, for example, US exports to Syria, didn't prevent US investment in Syria. It really put limitations on all other countries, all non-US actually countries and individuals from providing support, from doing business in Syria. So it was unique in a sense that this is the first time, probably, or one of the first times, where the US government is actively preventing other countries from engaging in Syria outside the UN parameters. So that, of course, has really a huge impact right now on the economy, specifically on the ability of countries in the region or in Europe to provide the necessary support for the Syrian government these days. The second factor is, with Assad leaving, we've really seen a partial collapse of the state. Not only that, a lot of government officials, employees have kind of abandoned posts, and the new government is trying to rebuild everything, sometimes from scratch, but also in terms of the complete lack of resources, the almost destroyed infrastructure across the country, not only because of the war, but because a lot of this infrastructure hasn't been updated in over a decade. The Syrian pound has lost around 95% of its value since the war in 2011. Income has really dropped. We're talking about 90% of the Syrian people under poverty line, with the average monthly income around $18, basically around $50 a day. So with all of those circumstances in place, this is kind of like where the Syrian economy is right now.
And just to paint a picture of everything you described in terms of what Syria's economy was like before the civil war began and before sanctions were imposed, can you paint that picture just to understand what that looked like compared to what Syrians are experiencing today?
Absolutely. I mean, before the war, we were talking about average income around $220 to $240 a month. Most of the economy is really dependent on small and medium businesses in the agriculture and small manufacturing. Of course, as a state, part of the GDP was oil production and some resources, natural resources around the country. But specifically, agriculture and industrial activities were taking a big portion of the economy, to the extent that up until 2011, 70% of the labor force in Syria was actually working in agriculture, which specifically, because of the drought that came right before the war and the uprising in 2011, because of the displacement that happened after 2011, the vast majority of whom is actually displacement from rural countries, from actually the agricultural community, the activity in the agricultural community has really dropped significantly. I think to add to that, and this has really impacted a lot of sectors in Syria, the cost of fuel in Syria is one of the highest in the region. And as such, it's really impacting the ability to really resume activities in agriculture, but it's also impacting the ability of the government to produce electricity. So I think if we want to compare kind of like between February 2011, right before the uprising, and the moment today, the country right now didn't really or let's say throughout those 14 years, didn't really stop in time. It went backwards probably a decade or two. And I think the most significant impact we see today is really the brain drain that Syria has gone through in the last 15 years. Almost half of the Syrian people are displaced. We don't know exactly how many Syrians are there as part of the Syrian society. The latest poll was in 2001, which counted around 24 million Syrians. The expectations that we are talking now, 25 years later, we're talking about 30 or 32 million Syrians. Half of those only are inside the country. The other half is displaced across the region, in Europe and in other places. And we see that even impacting the government's ability to rebuild a lot of the government institutions and trying to address really the degradation in many of the sectors, especially education, for example.
And you'd mentioned about the cost of energy. And We'd actually written an article about will Syria be able to get back, now that with the sanctions removed, will Syria be able to re-enter the oil market to be able to monetize from that? How do you see the likelihood of Syria getting back into selling oil?
So twofolds here. The first one, of course, we are still talking about sanction exemptions and general licenses. We don't really have complete sanction lifting in a sense, especially from the US side. And again, because of the impact of the Caesar Act, it doesn't really matter if Europe removed their sanctions, if the region removed their sanctions. As long as US sanctions, especially Caesar, is still in place, countries in Europe and in the region will continue to be unable to provide support to the Syrian government and engage meaningfully. I think when it comes to the oil sector specifically, definitely more sanction relief is needed to revive the sector. Syria has a reserve of around 6 billion barrels of oil, of crude oil. The extractable part of that, however, is around 2 billion. It's not the full 6 billion. So far, since the 90s until today, the estimate is that Syria has extracted around 1.2 billion barrels of that oil. So whatever is left now, of course, will be less and less in the next decade. But to be able to effectively revive the sector, there are a lot of repairs that are needed. There are a lot of injection processes. Extraction process, I think the least to say, many professionals in the oil sector would tell you it's just brutal. So many of those oils actually might need to be closed completely. You might need to drill new oil wells, but also you need a lot of machinery and technology to be brought in.
So it's going to take a while for the infrastructure maybe to catch up, to be able to be effective even if sanctions were eased?
It will definitely take time. I think more important than the oil sector, though, is the natural gas sector, because Syria has a larger natural gas reserve than oil. It's still very profitable, but it does require a lot of repair, a lot of investment, basically, to be able to meet the needs across the country.
And this is a bit of a big question, but were sanctions effective on Syria, and to whom?
That is a very good question. I think, in a sense, the way I would describe sanctions are chemotherapy to a cancer. The same way chemo doesn't only impact the cancer that a body has, it impacts literally everything in the body. Sanctions have the similar impact. And I find it sometimes ridiculous when people say, like, no, there are targeted sanctions, there are smart sanctions.
Similarly, smart sanctions, agree with you, don't exist. They will always be possibilities. Collateral damage.
How can we make sure that sanctions are really smart, at least from a UK?
Yes, there are smart sanctions as much as there is a smart chemotherapy for cancer. It will have its impact. It did have its impact on Syria for sure, as we've seen. In the Syrian case, though, I think it's really been a unique case where you can really say that sanctions have significantly led to a regime change. This is probably one of the first cases in the political science field where we've seen kind of like a linkage between the impact of sanctions and regime change. So it's still, I think, a lot of people are still studying that to try to really find the connections, how sanctions really impacted specifically the regime ability to rebuild its military institution, have impacted morale, the ability of even existing fighters to really maintain kind of like a professional posture as a military force. The impact it had over the country and over the Syrian people, over the average Syrian economy is something that we see now in Syria every day.
And speaking of something that sanctions created, it led to the birth and growth of the illicit Captagon trade.
See here some of the methods that have been used to smuggle the Captagon. So the pills will be hidden in those fake fruits. And then
what effect has this had on Syria, and what will it look like if and when sanctions are lifted?
Absolutely. So in terms of Captagon's birth as an illicit trade was the result of sanctions on one hand, basically the regime's inability to get resources, but also the result of the 12 or 10 years of war, because regime officials were not able to pay salaries to their comrades, to their soldiers. So basically, they allowed the Captagon trade to flourish as a way to compensate for the lack of resources they're able to provide to their soldiers. Today, it looks like the whole sector actually has collapsed in Syria. We have seen at least some open source intelligence indicating that the major factories for production of Captagon, for the packaging, which is more important, has all been dismantled. I'm still sure there are still some mom and pop shops, in a sense, that can produce Captagon, because in a sense, also the production doesn't really require, when people talk about factories, it's not really like a 100,000 foot factory where you need like a whole production line. It's literally 3 machines. They can fit into like a large living room of any house or like in a basement. However, I think there are 2 factors that truly impact the ability of the industry to continue. One, that the smuggling networks, most of the smuggling networks have been dismantled, whether on the borders with Lebanon or the borders with Jordan. But also more importantly, I think the political environment does not really allow anyone to move forward with such production. Because right now, the production and trade of Captagon is really very much still connected to the Assad regime. So no one wants to be in a position where they're caught with a Captagon trade, and then they're going to be immediately affiliated with the Assad regime because of that trade.
HTS recently appointed a new cabinet, including Economic Minister Nidal al-Sha'ar,
وتمكين الطاقات الشابة والنساء ودعم المتضررين وعائلات الشهداء.
who notably also served in the same role from 2011 to 2012 under Bashar Al Assad. So on March 29, the day his cabinet was formed, al-Sha'ar talked a bit about its rebuilding strategy, saying it focuses on the production sector, on small and medium-sized projects, on innovation. How do you see that?
I mean, I think, first of all, I think Nidal Sha'ar is a well-versed economist. His work in Syria and outside Syria is something notable. He's also a graduate of George Washington University here in Washington. He's Syrian American, so he studied here also. He's got the connections. And I think he would be very helpful, to be honest, to help the Syrian economy in this transition, if, of course, sanctions are lifted, if the environment is there. I think in his plan, he's really trying to go back to the basis of the Syrian economy. Again, small and medium enterprises that have really contributed to the vast majority of the economic activity of the GDP of the Syrian state for the last few decades. And I think this is more correct now than ever. And in a sense, also, the SME sector is the one that would be capable of largely producing more jobs in the market, which I think is the one thing that Syria really needs right now, specifically to encourage more return, but also not only to encourage, but also to respond to the already return rate that we see today. We're talking about right now 300 to 350,000 Syrians who have already returned back to the country. So we're talking about probably 70,000 families or 70,000 jobs that would be needed to those who have already returned. So again, focusing on SMEs, I think, is the best way, on one hand, to operate still in a sanctioned environment, but also to create as many jobs as needed for existing population and for the one that is expected to return.
I appreciate your time.
Of course. Thank you so much.
That's all for this episode of Business Extra. You can follow updates on this story and more at thenationalnews.com. This episode was produced by Yasmin Al-Taji. Our audio engineer is Arthur Edison. Our editor is Duat Farid. And I've been your host, Salim As-Saeed.